Number 1. Mansa Musa and the wealth they didn't teach. In 1375, a Catalan cartographer drew a map of the known world and placed a figure at its center wearing a gold crown and holding a gold nugget the size of his fist. He labeled the figure by name, Mansa Musa, ruler of Mali, and noted in the margin that his lands were so rich in gold that he was the wealthiest lord in all the world. The map is in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France and has been there since the 14th century. The man on it is not in most history textbooks. Mansa Musa ruled the Mali Empire at its peak in the early 14th century, presiding over a state that controlled more than half of the world's gold supply and administered cities larger than anything in contemporary Europe. In 1324, he left Mali on a pilgrimage to Mecca and took with him 60,000 people, 80 camels carrying gold dust, and so much currency that his spending in Cairo, in Alexandria, and across the Mediterranean depressed the price of gold for a decade afterward. Contemporary Egyptian chroniclers documented the inflation with irritation. Merchants who had dealt in gold for generations suddenly found it nearly worthless because a man from Mali had passed through and spent too freely. This was not a regional event. A single ruler from West Africa caused a macroeconomic disruption across 3 continents that lasted 10 years, and it is documented in the records of every economy it touched. Ibn Battuta visited the Mali Empire 28 years later and wrote about its legal order, its administrative complexity, its cities, and its justice system, with the attention of a man describing something that surprised him with its sophistication. He was not easily surprised. He had traveled from Morocco to China. The standard Western medieval survey covers this period in detail. It covers the 100 Years' War, the Black Death, the Avignon Papacy, and the economic disruption of the mid-14th century. The gold price collapse that preceded all of it, caused directly by Mansa Musa, does not appear in that account as a subject with a named origin. The Catalan Atlas names him. The textbooks that cover the same century do not. Mali's erasure was economic. The mechanism was curriculum, and the curriculum had a center of gravity that was not West Africa. Further south, the erasure was architectural, and the mechanism was a man with a shovel and an agenda. Number 2. Great Zimbabwe and the man hired to be wrong. The walls are still there. They rise 11 meters from the ground, built from granite blocks fitted without mortar across a circumference that took 10,000 people to maintain at its peak, and they have been standing for 600 years. When European settlers arrived in the region in the late 19th century and saw them, the question they asked was not who built this, it was who built this that was not African. The answer they hired someone to find did not exist, but the hiring is documented. Richard Hall was employed by the British South Africa Company in the early 1900s to excavate Great Zimbabwe and produce a report on its origins. His prior publications had already argued for Phoenician or Arabian builders. The job was given to him because of that position, not in spite of it. He excavated by removing the upper layers of the site systematically, destroying the stratigraphic record that would have dated the construction and identified its builders. When he was finished, the physical evidence for indigenous African origin had been significantly degraded. His report attributed the site to a pre-African civilization. Gertrude Caton Thompson arrived in 1929 with a properly conducted excavation and a different method. She dug carefully, she recorded stratigraphy, and she published her findings in 1931 with a conclusion that has not been seriously challenged since. Great Zimbabwe was built by the ancestors of the Shona people, constructed over several centuries beginning around the 11th century, and there is no credible evidence of any foreign origin. She said this clearly, and the Rhodesian colonial government suppressed her findings for 4 decades. The reason is not obscure. A sophisticated indigenous African civilization predating European contact complicated the political argument for colonial administration. Great Zimbabwe needed to have been built by someone else, and when the archaeology refused to cooperate, the government that needed it to cooperate simply declined to publicize the result. Caton Thompson's report sat in the academic record while the colonial story continued in the popular one. The buildings themselves were indifferent to the argument being conducted around them. They are still there. The suppression is documented. The man who was hired to reach the wrong conclusion is also documented. In the records of the company that hired him, Great Zimbabwe was erased by people who needed it to have been built by someone else, and the erasure required active institutional effort to maintain. The next empire was hidden not by institutional effort, but by 800 years of jungle growing over the shape of a city the size of a modern metropolitan area. Number 3. The City Under the Jungle, KHMER's real scale. In 2012, a researcher named Damien Evans flew a plane over the jungle surrounding Angkor Wat and pointed a LiDAR sensor at the ground below. LiDAR fires laser pulses through vegetation and reads the returns from the surface underneath. It sees through trees the way sonar sees through water, and what it showed Evans beneath the jungle canopy of Cambodia had not been visible to any previous survey. A city, not the city of Angkor Wat, which was already known and already large. A second city, a grid of streets, reservoirs, embankments, and residential blocks extending in every direction for hundreds of kilometers, connected to Angkor at the center and dwarfing it in scale. The findings were published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and they reclassified the Khmer Empire in a single paper. What had been understood as a large regional power with an impressive temple complex became the largest low-density urban civilization ever confirmed, a hydraulic city that may have housed 1 to 2 million people at its peak, with water management infrastructure on a scale that required central planning across a territory larger than modern France. Evans described it as seeing a familiar painting and discovering it was only the corner of a much larger canvas. The mainstream position had always acknowledged that Angkor was significant. The LiDAR did not contradict that. It expanded it to the point where the previous framing became inadequate. A civilization that managed water for 1 to 2 million people across hundreds of kilometers is not a regional power with an impressive temple. It is one of the largest states in human history at its operational peak. The jungle held the shape of the city for 800 years, while the textbooks described the corner. The sensor showed the rest in an afternoon. The next empire left no jungle to hide behind. It left libraries, and the libraries survived, and almost nobody in the Western historiographical tradition has ever mentioned them. Number 4. Timbuktu's books and the history of scholarship that left them out. There is a family in Timbuktu named Haidara that has been storing manuscripts for 600 years. The manuscripts are in Arabic, in Malian languages, in the margins of Quranic texts, and the bodies of legal treatises and the lecture notes of professors who taught at the University of Sankor in the 15th century. The family has somewhere between 30,000 and 100,000 of them. The count is uncertain because the cataloging is incomplete and has been incomplete for centuries. They are not unique in Timbuktu. Estimates of the total surviving manuscript collection across the city's private libraries run to 700,000 documents. Leo Africanus visited Timbuktu in the 1510s and wrote that the book trade was more profitable than any other commerce in the city, that merchants made more money selling manuscripts than selling gold or salt, and that this was considered normal. He was describing a book market that operated on the same scale, at the same period, as the early European print trade, in a city that Western historiography has consistently described as a trade post rather than an intellectual center. The University of Sankor operated with named professors, named students, named curricula, and named degrees in theology, law, mathematics, astronomy, and history. It was contemporaneous with Oxford, with Bologna, with the University of Paris. The history of the medieval university, which is a standard subject in Western medieval historiography, does not include it. Not as a parallel, not as a comparison, not as a footnote. The history of medieval scholarship was written by one tradition about itself, and Sankor was in a different tradition. 700,000 manuscripts are sitting in private homes in Timbuktu, partially cataloged, waiting for a historiography that has not yet decided they count. The absence is not an accident of evidence. The evidence has been there for 600 years. Songhai's erasure was intellectual, its scholarship excluded from the history of scholarship by the tradition that wrote that history. The next empire contributed directly to the civilization that wrote it out, and the debt has never been acknowledged in the places where it was incurred. Number 5. Byzantium's last scholars and the Renaissance they seeded. You are Georgios Francis, personal secretary to Constantine XI, the last emperor of Byzantium, and you are watching Constantinople fall. It is the 29th of May, 1453, and the Ottoman army has been at the walls for 53 days. You will survive, you will be taken as a slave and later ransomed, and you will spend the rest of your life writing down everything you saw, because you were there at the end of a civilization that had lasted 1100 years, and you understood that if you did not write it down, nobody would. Your account survives. The debt that civilization was owed by the one that absorbed its scholars does not appear anywhere in the record of the civilization that benefited. In the century before the fall, Byzantine scholars had been leaving Constantinople in a steady stream, carrying manuscripts westward into Italian courts. Plato in Greek, Aristotle in the original, medical and mathematical texts that had survived in Byzantine libraries while their Latin translations circulated incomplete in the West. They arrived in Florence, in Venice, in Rome, and they brought with them the textual foundations of what Italian humanists would call a rebirth of classical learning. The Greek texts that powered the Renaissance were Byzantine texts. carried west by Byzantine scholars who knew the city was dying and moved the library before the walls came down. The standard account of the Renaissance attributes its origins to Italian humanism, to Petrarch and Boccaccio, and the recovery of classical texts through monastic libraries. The Byzantine scholars who physically carried the manuscripts west appear in that account as a secondary factor, a useful supplement to an Italian intellectual movement that had already begun. Francis watched the city fall and wrote it down in a chronicle that Western medieval historiography treats as a source for Byzantine history, rather than as a primary document in the origins of European modernity. The books arrived in Italy. The people who carried them were absorbed into the footnotes. Byzantium's contribution was carried west by people who knew exactly what they were doing, and then attributed to the civilization that received it. The next empire was not absorbed into someone else's story. It was turned into a myth by the civilization that followed it, deliberately and for political reasons. And the myth replaced the history so completely that recovering the history requires reading the myth against itself. Number 6. Chain and the empire the Inca absorbed. This is the largest adobe city ever built. Chan covers 20 square kilometers on the north coast of Peru, and at its peak it housed 60,000 people in a planned urban environment with royal compounds, administrative quarters, and a hydraulic system that extracted water from the desert through a network of channels that took 3 centuries to construct. The Inca conquered it in 1470, and within a generation it had ceased to function as a capital. Within 2 generations it had been absorbed so completely into the Inca administrative record that the civilization that built it had effectively ceased to exist as a named historical subject. The Chimu Empire built Chan beginning in the 9th century and ruled the largest coastal state in pre-Columbian South America for 500 years before the Inca arrived. Michael Mosley's work on Andean civilizations documents the Chimu's administrative sophistication, a bureaucratic system with specialist labor, state storage, and craft production, at a scale that the Inca recognized immediately as more advanced than their own. When the Inca conquered the Chimu, they did not destroy the administrative class. They moved it to Cusco, renamed it, and put it to work running the Inca state. The metallurgists who produced Inca gold work were largely Chimu craftsmen. The textile techniques that define Inca material culture were largely Chimu techniques. The administrative systems that made the Inca Empire function across a territory of nearly 2 million square kilometers were built on Chimu foundations that the Inca conquered, renamed, and claimed. The historiography of the Inca, which is itself the product of Spanish colonial sources that were already filtering the record through an Inca lens, does not distinguish between what the Inca developed and what they inherited. Chan is still the largest adobe city ever built. It does not appear in most world history textbooks as a primary subject. The Inca, who could not have functioned without it, appear in the same textbooks in its place. The Chimu were absorbed upward into their conqueror's story so thoroughly that the story forgot to mention them. The next civilization was absorbed in a different direction, not into its conqueror's history, but into its own mythology, transformed from an empire into a golden age by the people who conquered it and needed a legendary past to justify their rule. Number 7. The Toltec Empire and what the Aztec needed it to be. The city of Tula is 2 hours north of Mexico City, and it contains the remains of a major urban center that housed 60,000 people at its peak in the 10th and 11th centuries. Temples, colonnaded halls, warrior sculptures 15 feet tall, and evidence of a trade network that reached from the American Southwest to Central America. The Aztec called it Tolan and described it as a paradise, a golden city where the buildings were made of jade and gold and turquoise, where the corn grew in colors that do not exist, where the ruler Quetzalcoatl was so holy that he never shed blood. The archaeology of Tula shows a real city with real temples and evidence of real human sacrifice. The gap between the Aztec account and the physical record is not a discrepancy, it is a policy. The Aztec needed the Toltec to be legendary because they claimed descent from them. Every Aztec ruler traced his lineage back to Toltec royalty, and every Aztec claim to legitimacy rested on that lineage being credible. The transformation of a real historical empire into a mythological golden age was Aztec state ideology, conducted systematically across several generations, and it worked well enough that separating the historical Toltec from the mythological Toltec remains genuinely difficult. Nigel Davies spent a career doing it and concluded that the reconstruction is possible but always inferential. The Aztec sources are the primary record, and the Aztec sources had a political interest in every sentence they wrote about their predecessors. What survives of the actual Toltec state is archaeological. The physical city, The trade goods, the architectural influence visible in Chichen Itza, where Toltec-style warrior columns appear in a Maya city 1,000 kilometers from Tula, implying a network of influence the mythology does not describe because the mythology was not interested in trade networks. The Toltec built an empire that shaped Mesoamerica for centuries, and then were turned into a legend by the civilization that needed them to be one. The legend replaced the history so effectively that when Spanish chroniclers arrived and asked about the past, the Aztec gave them the legend. The Spanish wrote it down. The legend became the source. The source became the textbook. The textbook does not contain the city. The Toltec were turned into myth by the civilization that followed them and needed them to be more than they were. The next empire was written out of a history it had every right to be part of, the history of Christianity, by the tradition it had helped to create. Number 8. A.K. Suem and the Christian Empire Christianity forgot. The tallest of the Aksumite stelae is 33 meters of solid granite, carved to look like a multi-story building, and it has been standing in northern Ethiopia for 1,700 years. It is the largest monolithic obelisk ever erected in the ancient world. It is also one of the most visible artifacts of an empire that does not appear in standard accounts of early Christian history, despite being one of the first Christian states in the world, and among the most consequential in early Christianity's survival. The Aksumite Empire adopted Christianity as its state religion in roughly 330 AD, within years of Constantine's conversion and decades before Christianity became the official religion of Rome. Aksum had been minting its own coinage since the 3rd century, controlled the Red Sea trade routes that connected the Mediterranean to India and Arabia, and maintained diplomatic correspondence with Rome, Persia, and Byzantium as an equal power. Stuart Munro Hay's work, the standard academic reference on Aksumite civilization, documents a state of administrative and commercial sophistication that operated for 7 centuries and shaped the political geography of Northeast Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. The standard Western account of early Christianity's spread traces a line from Jerusalem to Antioch to Rome and outward through the Roman Empire. Aksum is not on that line, despite the fact that the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which descends directly from Aksumite Christianity, is older than most of the European churches whose histories are considered foundational. The Aksumite king Ezana converted before most of Europe had heard of Christianity and left stone inscriptions recording his conversion, physical, dated, verifiable objects that sit in the archaeological record as primary evidence for a Christian empire the Western account of early Christianity does not include. The stelae are still standing. The church that grew from the empire they represent is one of the oldest continuous Christian institutions in the world. The history of early Christianity that appears in Western textbooks does not mention either of these facts as primary subjects. The erasure required no active suppression. It required only a historiographical tradition that drew its map of early Christianity from Rome outward and never looked south. Aksum was written out of Christian history by the tradition it helped create, through the passive mechanism of a map drawn from a center that was not Aksum. The next empire was written out of European history by a more active mechanism, by the tradition of the empire it nearly destroyed, writing about itself. Number 9. Tsar Simeon and the empire that almost took Constantinople. In 913 AD, a Bulgarian army stood outside the walls of Constantinople, and its commander, Tsar Simeon I, demanded to be crowned emperor of the Bulgarians and the Romans. The Byzantine court, facing a force that had spent 2 decades defeating every army sent against it, agreed. A patriarch came out of the city and placed a crown on Simeon's head. The Byzantines later said the crowning did not count because the wrong official performed it. Simeon went home, reorganized, and came back. The Battle of Anchialos in 917 is the largest Byzantine military defeat between the founding of the empire and the fall of Constantinople 5 centuries later. The Bulgarian army destroyed the Byzantine force so completely that the Byzantine commander was executed on his return to Constantinople for the scale of the failure. Simeon then spent the next decade methodically taking every Byzantine city in the Balkans, reducing the empire to Constantinople and its immediate surroundings, and ruling a state that at its peak controlled more territory than the Byzantium he was dismantling. He called himself Emperor of the Bulgarians and the Romans. He built a capital at Preslav that contemporaries described as rivaling Constantinople. He presided over a literary and cultural flowering that scholars of Slavic civilization call the Golden Age of Bulgarian culture. John Fine's work on early medieval Balkan history documents all of this in detail and notes, with some exasperation, that the First Bulgarian Empire remains almost entirely absent from Western medieval surveys, despite being the dominant power in southeastern Europe for much of the 9th and 10th centuries. The reason is not obscure. The primary sources for this period are Byzantine chronicles, and Byzantine chroniclers had structural reasons to minimize the power of a Slavic Christian ruler who had nearly ended their empire. The chronicle tradition that survived was the tradition of the civilization that had every incentive to make Simeon smaller than he was. Simeon called himself Emperor of the Romans. The Byzantine chronicles called him a troublesome neighbor. Western medieval historiography inherited the Byzantine account and did not check it against the territory Simeon actually controlled. The map would have told a different story. Bulgaria was minimized by the chronicles of the empire it nearly destroyed, and the minimization was transmitted intact into the historiographical tradition that relied on those chronicles. The last empire on this list was minimized by a different mechanism entirely, by an absence of anyone on the receiving end who was keeping records of what arrived. Number 10. Abubakar II, and the fleet that went west. You are Mansa Abubakar II, ruler of the Mali Empire, and you are about to give it up. It is 1311, and you control the largest empire in the Western world. More gold than any other ruler alive, more territory, more subjects, and you have become convinced that the Atlantic Ocean has another side and you want to know what is on it. You have already sent one fleet west, 2,000 boats, and one returned. The captain of the returning boat told you the other boats had been pulled into a river in the middle of the ocean, a current so powerful that none of them could resist it, and that he had turned back rather than follow. You listened to this account, abdicated the throne of Mali, and personally led a second fleet of 2,000 boats westward into the Atlantic. You were never seen again. Ibn Khaldun recorded this account in the 14th century, sourcing it to the court of Mansa Musa, Abubakari's successor, who told the story to officials he met during his pilgrimage. Ibn Khaldun is not a credulous chronicler. He is one of the most methodologically sophisticated historians of the medieval world, known precisely for his skepticism about unverified accounts, and he included this one because it came from a source he considered reliable. The account exists in one place, without corroboration, and the question of what happened to Abubakari's fleet has never been answered. The mainstream response is that an Atlantic crossing from West Africa in 1311 was beyond medieval navigational capacity, that the current the returning captain described was probably the North Equatorial Current, which does in fact run westward across the Atlantic, and that the absence of any evidence of arrival makes the story almost certainly a legend embroidered around a real maritime expedition that turned back. This is a reasonable position, and it cannot be closed. What it cannot account for is the detail that makes the account compelling beyond its surface claim. Ibn Khaldun's version includes the returning captain's specific description of a current in the middle of the ocean, a hydrological feature that is real, that runs exactly where he described it, and that would indeed have made turning back the rational choice. A fabricated account would not need this detail. A real account from a captain who encountered the North Equatorial Current and turned back from it would include exactly this detail. Abubakar II gave up the wealthiest empire in the world to find out what was on the other side of the ocean, and if he found it, nobody on that side was keeping records of who arrived. The 10 empires on this list were all real, all documented, all significant, and all absent from the standard account of the medieval world that most people were taught. The account was written from a center, and the center was not Mali, not Zimbabwe, not Timbuktu, not Aksum, not Bulgaria, not Chanshan. The empires that were not at the center were compressed, mythologized, attributed to someone else, or left out. The evidence for all of them was there the whole time, in the archives, in the ground, in the jungle, in the family libraries of Timbuktu, where 600 years of manuscripts are waiting for a history that has not yet decided to include them. If these are the stories you want more of, subscribe. There are more coming.